Our story today is a very dark one. It's a story that mixes politics, the military, research, scientists, doctors, torture, terrible diseases, and plagues. It's something that was kept hidden for a long time, or at least suppressed. It's something extremely embarrassing, not only for the Japanese Empire, but for the whole world. Because for a certain period of time, in that puppet state called Manchukuo, which we've already talked about when telling the story of Emperor Pui, in that territory in northern China, in ancient Manchuria, there was a secret, an unconfessable secret, a well-kept secret, a secret that the Japanese never intended to let it cross those borders, a terrible secret. There in Manchuria, there were research laboratories not to improve the living conditions of humanity, but to create weapons of mass destruction so horrifying that they inspired terror. It's a complex story, a story that for a long time was not told, and that today we are presenting to you. This is the story of Unit 731 and its commander, Lieutenant General Shiro, a story that sends chills down your spine. If today you find yourself in Manchuria or Korea, there is a number you absolutely cannot mention. That number is 731 or 731. It's a number that refers to a unit of the Japanese Army. It was engaged from the late 1930s until all of 1945 in forbidden research. Unit 731 was simply a secret laboratory for the research and development of biological, bacteriological, and chemical weapons, responsible for some of the most heinous and systematic war crimes in all of contemporary history. It's a story of pain because it involves experiments conducted on test subjects that weren't animals. They were living human beings, reduced to less than slaves and used in the most abject ways to study diseases. The story of Unit 731 begins in the early 1930s. In 1931, Japan attacked Manchuria. They created Manchukuo, a puppet state. They put Pui in charge, as we've already seen in another video you can find on the channel. Ainzingyo Pui, the last emperor of the Manchu dynasty. But Manchukuo is not a free state. Manchukuo is not an independent state. Manchukuo is nothing else. It's just a puppet in the hands of Tokyo. And Tokyo decides that Manchukuo must be, in addition to being the springboard for further conquests, starting with the conquest of mainland China, Manchukuo must also be a huge laboratory, a social laboratory, a research laboratory for forbidden weapons. The Geneva Convention had already banned them in light of what had happened during the Great War. All bacteriological and chemical weapons. All the states that signed the convention had made a commitment, not only to never use that kind of weapon again, but also not to conduct research or produce them. That was on paper. We know very well that even after the signing of the Geneva Convention, many states, some of which were involved in World War II, continued to conduct research and produce them. Italy, for example, continued to stockpile iperite and mustard gas used during the Ethiopian campaign of 1935 to 1936. The United States, as well as Great Britain, also continued their research on iperite, mustard gas, phosgene, and other toxic substances. And they have continued to do so, especially the United States up to the present day, developing terrible weapons like VX gas. The Soviet Union did the same. So, later on, starting in the 1960s, third world countries did as well. And what about Japan? Japan, as we were saying in the 1930s, decided to give free rein to a doctor, scientist, and researcher who was already part of the army. His name was Shiro, who graduated in 1920 and was immediately admitted to the Imperial Guard Regiment as a surgeon. And from August 1st, 1922, he was sent to carry out new research at the first military hospital in Tokyo. Shiro had become an eminent bacteriologist, an expert in the field. He had been sent to some regions like Shikoku to study epidemic diseases, sometimes even finding cures. An educated person, a brilliant person, a very intelligent person, Shiro had understood, for example, that the use of water pipes could also be exploited to spread pathogens. Even though he had taken the Hippocratic Oath, like all other doctors around the world, Shiro was willing due to a mistaken interpretation of what was the duty of every Japanese subject towards the emperor, to break that oath, to act in the opposite way, not to protect life, but to destroy it. On this subject, in a speech given right in Manchuria, in front of his officers, Shiro Ishii said, "Our divine mission, as doctors, is to challenge all varieties of microorganisms that cause diseases, to block all the ways these diseases can enter the human body, to annihilate all foreign particles that reside in our bodies, to define the fastest treatment, and to reinforce it." The research work we are about to embark on is the complete opposite of these principles, and it might even torment us as doctors, but we have to do it. He was a product of a period, the post-World War I era, in which Japan, Imperial Japan, was turning towards totalitarianism and European-style imperialism. Japan, too, was claiming a living space, colonies to exploit, territories to draw natural resources and labor from, everything Japan needed to become a great world power. In that tumultuous period, which also saw attempted coups, always, however, to glorify the emperor and never to overthrow him, the Japanese mentality was forged with iron discipline, almost to the point of exaggerating Machiavelli's maxim. The end always justifies any means, even extermination. And that's how Unit 731 was born, which was formally established in 1936. Even though that date only marks the arrival in Manchuria of the first medical research units where real research operations begin. In 1938, in a complex that no longer exists today, called Pingfang, a suburb of the large city of Harbin in Manchuria. This huge complex was a deception. Anyone who asked for information would have been told that in Pingfang there was the Department of Water Purification and Epidemic Prevention, a very clever name, devised by Shiro Ishii himself, and that rather than purifying water, something completely different was being done in Pingfang. It was indeed a military facility under the control of the Kwantung Army, but in reality, Pingfang was nothing more than a huge factory of death. Inside this facility, various types of experiments were conducted, some in laboratories, others on human subjects. The Japanese had coined a special word for these test subjects, maruta. It's a Japanese word that means brushwood, pieces of wood, something useless. The prisoners, human beings, were initially Chinese, then Mongolian, Russian, and after the outbreak of World War II, also British and Australian prisoners. They were treated not as human beings, but as simple research subjects, victims of something they couldn't understand. In Pingfang, medical science turned into an industrial system of extermination and research. Imagine Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz, his infirmary, his operating table. Multiply that by at least 100 times with practically unlimited funds available, with facilities that are not just a simple operating table, not just a simple infirmary ward. Imagine a huge hospital where experiments are carried out on living human beings. This was Pingfang. This was Unit 731, inside which there weren't sadistic torturers like Oscar Derlewanger or other members of the SS. They were actually some of the brightest people from Japanese universities, doctors, biologists, people who had studied educated individuals who believed they were working for the well-being of Japan and its emperor. But what was happening in Pingfang? Just think about this. The methods that were used were systematically and deliberately brutal, aimed at studying the effects of diseases and developing ways to spread them quickly and effectively. For example, when it came to the diseases they were infected with, prisoners were used, and lethal pathogens were intentionally injected into them. Bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, anthrax, and even dysentery. Once infected, the prisoners were monitored. Obviously, they were not treated. They simply observed how long it took for their bodies to completely deteriorate, the progression of the disease, the decay of internal organs, and finally, death. This alone is chilling enough, but they didn't stop there. In an area of Pingfang, inside that facility, they practiced vivisection. Yes, you heard right, the dissection of a living organism. Not mice, guinea pigs, or other lab animals, no, human beings. Without anesthesia, still conscious, they were slaughtered to examine the functioning of their internal organs, sometimes even to induce infections. They observed with curiosity, but also a hint of sadism, the suffering of these poor human beings, these Maruta. Freezing or dehydration tests were also carried out there to study the effects and develop effective treatments for the Japanese soldiers stationed in Manchuria, but also those fighting elsewhere in China or in the Pacific. Prisoners were exposed to extreme temperatures. Their arms and legs were frozen and then thawed using brutal methods to study the effects of gangrene and tissue decay. But in addition to the laboratory, vivisection, and the inoculation of diseases, there was also the study of biological weapons, which were made there and then tested. Plague bombs, aerial bombs filled with infected fleas, were dropped on Chinese cities during the attempt to conquer mainland China. Bombs that caused epidemics and the deaths of dozens, hundreds, thousands of civilians, as if it were nothing, as if it were something normal. All this was done at Pingfang, but not only that, prisoners were deprived of food, deprived of water. Gas chambers were also tested there, obviously not using Zyklon B, but using carbon monoxide. They tested how much a human being could withstand the shock waves from explosions. Or they studied the inoculation of syphilis, gonorrhea, and other sexually transmitted diseases to observe their progression. Everything, always only, on living human beings, on human guinea pigs, on Maruta. All this happened between 1938 and 1945 because Manchuria was not affected by the Second World War. Until August 45, Manchuria was a quiet, untouchable island. No bombing by the Allies, not even any plans for an amphibious landing to try to liberate the territory. The Kwantung Army spends weeks and months training quietly. Life is monotonous, and in Pingfang, people keep dying. But in August 1945, everything changes. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the atomic bombs. The Soviet Union, having settled accounts in the West with Nazi Germany, breaks the non-aggression pact and attacks Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, which melts away like snow in the sun in just 72 hours, and a Sinjoro Pui, who is forced to flee and is arrested by the Soviets. The Japanese have to make everything disappear. Unit 731 receives precise orders: destroy all evidence of what has been done. Pingfang is demolished with dynamite. No trace must remain, just like the retreating Nazis did, first at Sobibor, then at Chelmno, at Treblinka, at Belzec. In Manchuria, too, the Japanese try to erase what happened. The laboratories are destroyed. The last Maruta are killed en masse by gunfire and machine guns. No trace must remain, but in reality, a trace remains. Because in the archives of the Japanese Ministry of War, there are the reports. The reports of Shiro Ishii and his officers on what had been done, on the results. Shiro Ishii had already returned along with his collaborators when the first signs of the Soviet invasion appeared. He boarded a military plane, while his family had reached Busan in Korea by train, and from there had taken a ship to return home. Shiro Ishii had even gone so far as to fake his own death, complete with a funeral, on November 10, 1945. All this was to try to make the Americans forget about him, as if he had never existed, or as if he were indeed dead. But it wasn't enough to convince the Americans, who had found evidence of the atrocities committed by Unit 731 in the archives of the Ministry of War, and were looking for him. At the beginning of 1946, Shiro Ishii was recognized by a team of American investigators. He was arrested and placed under house arrest at his home. He was interrogated over and over again by an officer named Arvo Thompson. Shiro Ishii takes full responsibility for his actions but downplays them. He says that, after all, his research was nothing more than medical research using animal test subjects, and small ones at that, not human beings. Shiro Ishii denies everything. He denies the torture. He denies the most brutal parts of what happened at Pingfang. In the report from May 31, 1946, Thompson is extremely detailed. Yet, there is still something missing from his account. Ishii is interrogated over and over again, even by American scientists, to really understand what had happened. Yet Shiro Ishii manages to get away with it. Because while in Nuremberg there are several trials for the leaders, the SS concentration camp personnel, the Einsatzgruppen, even the doctors, Shiro Ishii and his team from Unit 731 obtain immunity. Why? Because on one hand, it is said that their actions cannot be fully verified. Of course, the victims are no longer there. They've all disappeared. The evidence, the material, tangible evidence, can no longer be found. Pingfang has been razed to the ground, and the dialogue with the Soviets is not simple. At the Tokyo trial, Shiro Ishii comes out as pure as the driven snow. Not only that, he is granted a pension corresponding to his rank as a lieutenant general in the Japanese army. He is guaranteed that he will never be bothered again. The reason for this will be discovered later. His research, especially on biological weapons, had been acquired by the U.S. Army and moved to Fort Detrick in Maryland, inside the U.S. Army's Research Center for Bacteriological and Chemical Weapons. All the material the Americans had managed to get their hands on, the result of years and years of massacres of innocents, was ultimately used by the Americans themselves to start over and create new, terrible weapons. And as a reward, Shiro Ishii remained a free man until 1959, when afflicted by laryngeal cancer, he died. He died leaving behind the memory of that forbidden number, 731A number, that still inspires horror today and disgust in Korea and Manchuria. A number connected to that place, Pingfang, a place that no longer exists, a number connected to that term, Marutha. Thousands of human beings used simply as guinea pigs. It's striking that on his deathbed, on October 9, 1959, in a hospital in Shinjuku, Shiro Ishii wanted a Catholic priest at his bedside, asked to be baptized as a Roman Catholic, and took the name Giuseppe, perhaps in an extreme attempt to ask for forgiveness for the crimes he committed. But how can one forget? How can one not want to understand more? How can what happened in Manchuria, in Darban, in Pingfang, inside the facilities of Unit 731, be dismissed? How can one think of Shiro Ishii and his collaborators as simple doctors, as mere scientists and not as torturers, as people devoid of any humanity, who in the name of a very distorted concept of loyalty to the emperor, decided to give up both their humanity and the Hippocratic oath they had taken? It's difficult, but this isn't the plot of a horror movie. It's not a science fiction novel. Unfortunately, this is history. And if, in the years and decades that followed, the great powers, the United States of America on one side, the Soviet Union on the other, were able to develop weapons of mass destruction, not only nuclear, but also chemical and bacteriological. It's also thanks to Shiro Ishii and Unit 731, a name that still causes horror in that part of the world today. And the reasons, I think after this video, you'll be able to figure them out for yourselves too.